Thank you, Dr. Wright, for taking us on a quest to reflect on our identity as a people of God. We now have two respondents to give their responses. First, we'll have Dr. Liu Kwan-Hung Li, lecturer, Divinity School of Chung College, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And then we will have Dr. Lilian Li, Assistant Professor, Biblical Studies and Associate Dean from CGST.
Thank you, Dr. Wright's clear and enjoyable lectures. And I'm honored to be here because I'm an alumnus of CGST, and there's many old friends and familiar faces here. And after we listen to this lecture of Dr. Wright, the Old Testament and Christian identity, who we are, we know that the purpose of this lecture is to explore our Christian identity through the lens of the Old Testament. As the subtitle of the lecture indicates, our Christian identity is twofold. We are people formed by God's story, and we are also a people created for God's glory, which is very memorable. In the first part of the lecture, Dr. Wright showed us that in the Old Testament, God's story is manifested by three stories in the OT: the human story, Abraham's story, and Israel's story. And these Old Testament stories can help us to define the identity of the New Testament church. In the second part, Dr. Wright talked about how the metaphorical language, the metaphor in the Old Testament, and this metaphor enable us to see who we are for God's glory. From the many metaphors in the Old Testament, Dr. Wright chooses three: the people, the household, and the temple, or the dwelling place of God, for his illustration. From my short summary, you can see Dr. Wright's lecture is so well organized and so easy to follow that it is really not challenging to outline his points. Dr. Wright's language is plain and direct, clear, and enjoyable, I must say, without academic or theological jargon. And his lecture is well found in the language we use in an evangelical church. Therefore, I'm sure today's audience can effortlessly absorb the message of this lecture. However, well, there is always a but. The scope of the first lecture of Dr. Wright may be, for some of us, too broad and general. At the end, we are in seminary and full of seminary students here. So this broad and general stroke of the Old Testament stories and the relationship of anti-church, it just seems not enough for some of us, maybe. For the benefit of doubt, knowing that there are still two more lectures to come, I believe we will be more satisfied after these 2 days. Unfortunately, due to my family duties and other obligations, I cannot attend the other lectures. But I'm looking forward to the first day's meeting and dinner. Yet, as a respondent, I would like to give some practical reflection on this lecture, especially here for the audience sitting here who may be seeking their identity as a Christian community in Hong Kong today. The beginning of Dr. Wright's lecture reminds me that the identity of Christians and church in Hong Kong is not only the chosen people of God, but also the human beings that God created. Generally speaking, not a very rigorous statement, the mainline churches in Hong Kong, statistically speaking, inherit our heritage from pieties and evangelical tradition. Sometimes the practice and the practices and teachings of many churches in Hong Kong focus on individual salvation and sanctification, and as a result, overlook the social and humanistic dimension of the gospel. Well, in recent years, Hong Kong churches have been aware of the social or even the political dimension of the gospel. But still, here I would like to highlight the humanistic dimension of the gospel when I reflect on Dr. Wright's lecture. The Old Testament creation story is a vital reminder to Hong Kong Christians and churches. Our identity as a human being created by God calls us to identify the joy and pain of being human. We can enjoy the beauty of God's creation and suffer from our fall from God's grace as human beings. We share more common ground with our fellow human brothers and sisters than we sometimes expect. I'm not only talking about environmental protection that we often talk about in our church, but the culture mandate that we sometimes pay lip service on how to be human, well, correctly under the light of the gospel. Through literature, art, or other humanistic endeavors, can we as a Christian contribute to Hong Kong's literature, art, film, or other forms of cultural manifestations to show how to be a good, whole, healthy human being? Well, I'm teaching a class on the narrative art of the Hebrew Bible this term. In the course, the student and I will discuss what means Old Testament as literature. Old Testament, which has more genre varieties than the New Testament as literature, is an excellent starting point for us to think about this aspect of our identity as God's created human person. Well, previously I catch up with Lilian and talk about the trends of Old Testament studies, and you will see that many faculties and departments in the foreign countries, Europe or England or in United States, most of the Old Testament studies is focused on Old Testament or Hebrew Bible as a cultural artifact, their receptions, the cultural meaning of the Old Testament story to the Western world, Western civilization and cultures. And even in China, as I know it, many studies on Old Testament are in the names of literature criticism, because that's how they can survive in China's regime. You know that. So I hope this remark also aligns with the central theme of Dr. Wright's lectures, that is to show that Old Testament is very crucial for the New Testament churches, New Testament church, the Christian community in Hong Kong. To comment on how Abraham and Israel's story shed light on our Christian identity here in Hong Kong, I'd like to focus not on their general representation as a community of faith, but their particular location as a stranger in the land, as Abraham, in Abraham's stories, and as an exilic community in Israel's case. Dr. Wright has talked about how Abraham's obedience leads him to face, I quote from the script I received previously or earlier time, the supreme test of sacrificing the son. Still, there are other tests. What Asian Jewish interpreters expound on the 10 trials of Abraham may be more revealing to our Christian identity as a Hong Konger, as a Christian in Hong Kong. Similarly, Dr. Wright has briefly discussed the struggle in Israel's story, which would resonate more with Hong Kong's Christian and churches. I quote from the script I received, "They failed internally and they were attacked externally. It rings a bell. Well, I hope, if possible, Dr. Wright maybe respond more on Abraham's identity crisis. Remember how he reacts to his wife's conditions? An Israelite identity crisis in the exilic period, in which the Old Testament verses are predominantly articulate. But to be fair, I can't judge a speaker by what he didn't say. But if Old Testament is beneficial for forming the identity of a Christian faith community here in Hong Kong today, I would say how Abraham or Israelites resolve their identity crisis may be more captivating for our audience today. I think I'm running out of time. I'm not commenting on the last part of Dr. Wright's and make more room for Lilian. But for a final remark, especially using Old Testament metaphor and metaphorical language to help New Testament church or churches in Hong Kong expressing our identity, it is very practical and very important, because sometimes churchgoer in Hong Kong is very unimaginative, which metaphors may be lacking in our language. These Old Testament metaphors are the essential guide to reformulate or reformation of our church identity and mission in the time of unfavorable times as we are now facing. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for giving us an insightful lecture and demonstrating how to answer the question, who are we, or more specifically, who are we as the church, through the lens of the Old Testament. Among the 4 different topics of the lectures concerning Christian identity, Christian mission, Christian ethics, and Christian hope, Dr. Wright has chosen to start with the topic of our identity. Undoubtedly, the question of who are we is the most fundamental. Before asking the question, what is our mission or what is our obligation, we cannot avoid defining our identity first. By illustrating 2 key ideas, we are the people formed by God's story, and we are the people created for God's glory. Dr. Wright has affirmed that our identity, as well as the identity of the church, is deeply associated with the whole history in the Old Testament. In the first part, Dr. Wright has shown that different parts of history in the Old Testament, including the creation, the fall, the redemption history, and the story of Israel, are all involved in developing our identity as the church. And it is especially in Israel's story, the election, redemption, covenant with God, and also struggle, that we have been given the essence of a community of faith. In the second part, it has been shown that some imageries and metaphors which are used in both testaments, such as God's people, God's family, and God's dwelling place, can illustrate the identity of the Christian church and also testify to the continuity, organic continuity of the 2 testaments. Certainly, Dr. Wright has let us comprehend the identity of the church in a more holistic way across the testaments. But despite the obvious continuity between the 2 testaments, some may still have the question, what is the actual deficiency in just reading the New Testament without referring to the story of the Old Testament. For the ideas such as election, redemption, covenant, and priesthood are appearing in both two testaments. In other words, will our understanding of Christian identity be distorted if we ignore the scriptures of the Old Testament? Since Christians agree that it is the events concerning the Christ, including the cross and the resurrection, are the center and the climax of the whole story. Is it possible that we just focus on or pay attention to the New Testament? Here, I will try to respond to this question in the light of Dr. Wright's lecture. Firstly, and most obviously, the Old Testament provides a concrete theological background for the interpretation of the metaphors, which are related to the church's identity. For example, as mentioned in the lecture, the temple imagery used by Paul at different levels to describe the individual Christian, the local church, and the whole church can be only interpreted thoroughly by referring to its symbolic usage as God's dwelling place in the Old Testament. Secondly, we may find that the Old Testament provides a wider and broader perspective of our identity, which may not be articulated explicitly in the New Testament. Dr. Wright has reminded us that the deep root of the church's identity does not lie in the Pentecost event in Acts, but in something that far precedes it. Our identity is given as far back as in the story of creation. As Dr. Wright says, we are human beings created in the image of God, intended to function as kings and priests within God's creation, ruling it and serving it on God's behalf. This is an important perspective of our identity, which is seldom emphasized in the New Testament. If the Christian church ignores the Old Testament and this wider perspective of identity, it is not surprising that the duty of caring the creation, that is to say the environment or the society, has been regarded and rarely considered as the mission of the church. Thirdly, it is through the records of the interaction between Yahweh and his people in the Old Testament that we can perceive our identity. According to Dr. Wright, our identity is rooted in the stories, both the Abrahamic and Israelite stories. Likewise, in the book telling the Old Testament story, the Old Testament's Professor Dr. Brian Callen offers a narrative telling of the Old Testament with the idea that Scripture's story can shape the identity of those who read it. Scripture's story can shape the identity of those who read it. I think for identity cannot come from a vacuum. Identity is not just an abstract concept assigned by someone or by an external institution. Without stories, an identity is empty and cannot shape our sense of belonging. Therefore, the Old Testament provides the narrative undergirding our identity and becomes a crucial foundation for us to develop our sense of belonging as a covenantal community. Because we can understand what a covenant relationship is and how it works in reality through its records of interactions between Yahweh and Israel. Furthermore, as Dr. Wright noted, the struggle of Israel is also significant for understanding our identity. In fact, throughout the Old Testament, the struggles or the failures of Israel occupy the most part of the scriptures. Directly after the covenant making at Mount Sinai, where Israel's covenant relationship with Yahweh began, Israel started rebelling against Yahweh continuously. From the wilderness to Canaan, and from the period of monarchy to exile. In addition to the historical books, the books of the prophets also deal mostly with the problem of Israel's rebellion. So, what is the significance of this enduring record of failure to the Christian church today? How do these scriptures help us understand our identity, or are these records only variable for anticipating the coming of Jesus Christ? In fact, those unsuccessful experiences of Israel may offer at least two important insights for us. First, by examining all the admonishments and punishments in the books of prophets, we can see how Yahweh highly desires his covenant partner to show faithfulness and obedience to him. Second, no matter how times Israel disappointed Yahweh, God remained just as faithful to his election of and covenant relationship with them. We have to confess that our church today, especially in our context, Hong Kong, is also undergoing different struggles and failures, like Israel did. Therefore, it is very important that we find deep encouragement in those scriptures which demonstrates God's unconditional election and unconditional love of Israel. For we can then envisage that God would treat his church in a similar way today. Without examining the Old Testament, particularly the history of Israel's struggles and failures, we cannot imagine how abundant the steadfast love of God is, and also cannot realize the significance of our covenantal identity. In conclusion, we have established the significance of reading the Old Testament to answer the question, who are we? Although many ideas about our identity appear in both testaments, we may still suffer from a superficial understanding of this concept if we do not scrutinize the scriptures in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, particularly its specific allusion to God's steadfastness towards a failed covenant partner, can provide not simply the theological background, but also a wider perspective and comprehensive narrative to help us perceive our identity as a Christian church. That is why we can conclude that the Old Testament as Christian scripture is written for us. Now, let us show our gratitude and appreciation again to Dr. Wright for his insights from our lecture. Thank you, Dr. Wright. Thank you.